Thanks for inviting me out. It is that time when we have to pay a little bit more attention to things, and we are, as always, moving into the future. But just a little bit about myself before we get started is that I've been in the industry for a long time, growing plants and having, building businesses and landscape companies and nurseries and all that kind of thing over the years. And I started way back when I was just a kid doing landscaping. I was kind of a real scrawny little guy, so the guys I used to work with, they weren't super happy on having me out there because I was kind of tiny, like I guess I was about 14, 15 years old, and I just wanted to get working, and they're like, oh yeah, you can come out and work with us. And then we found out that, we were going to be packing wheelbarrows full of dirt and turf and all that kind of thing. And it was quite the adventure, and it pretty much broke me. And I think my fellow workers identified that right away. My boss, he says, you know what, I've got a job in the greenhouse I got to get you to do. We need you in there. So he got me into the greenhouses, and that was really amazing for me. I was just like, what? You can work in a greenhouse? Are you kidding me? Full of tropical plants, and doing cuttings and all that kind of thing. And that was fabulous. And that was about 45 years ago. So it's been quite the journey since. And I think when I got out of that greenhouse, I just, the lights were starting to come on. Like, hey, this is what I want to do. So I really found what I love, and been pretty lucky to have spent my life up to this point working in the industry. So working with the KHS landscape professionals, doing the landscaping, and growercoach.com, doing teaching online and videos, that sort of thing. So you can always check out Grower Coach on YouTube. And the garden show, of course, on Saturday mornings, and some of you listen in, and we do the gardening program every Saturday, coming up to our 2000th show at the end of May this year, so we're going to have a big celebration for that. That's a lot of Saturdays in a row. I think about it. Oh my God. But it's fun, that's for sure. And all kinds of things, the Grower Coach on YouTube, the blogs, and podcasts, and newsletters, the teaching, public speaking, and over 2,500 landscape designs, and 45 years in the industry. So it's all starting to add up, and I'm getting old. That's the way it goes. But today's talk is about a lot of different things about the future and where we're going, and what we need to look for, what we need to just be cognizant of. And it seems like it's pretty much all about the water. And from a standpoint of say stratas or wherever you, even if you're just in a regular small residential home, you hear about it all the time. People are saying, oh, you gotta conserve water. And I think sometimes we're not always 100% sure maybe why, or if they're just saying this because they want us to do it, or it's, water is very expensive, so we know that for sure, that the communities, wherever you are, want you to conserve water so that you can, they can save money. And the infrastructure, particularly in the valley here, because we are a desert climate or semi-arid desert, that the infrastructure really is maxed out at all times. It's just always maxed. So now we have more and more people moving to the communities, so that means that we need more and more water, more buildings, more everything. And so that's what happens is you end up basically running short of water. Even if there's enough water there, can you actually move it from point A to point B and get the water to the people? And so what they do is they say, well, maybe we can keep our infrastructure and just have you guys back off a little bit on the usage, right? So that's sort of the deal. Now, fire smarting is a big deal, and I know that I'm sure you guys have had some education on this already, because each community, everywhere in BC especially, they are always saying about how important it is to be aware of the wildfires. We experienced it here in the Okanagan, for several times, where it gets pretty frightening, really, when we start seeing the ambers floating for a couple kilometers and dropping out of nowhere. And so with that in mind, again, each community, each area has been advertising and putting out all kinds of flyers and information, getting people to change their ways and to adjust their landscapes and adjust their water use and all this kind of thing. And this is just an advertisement I found. It was from Sook on the island, and I'm thinking, wow, these guys are way more humid than we are. Like, we're in literally a desert here, and so you can imagine how much more humidity they have there. So it's just harder to burn things when you have higher humidity. recently, they've been having problems too. It's just been drying right out. So it's a pretty interesting program. So with the Fire Smart programs, they talk a lot about this, about the building being, the key center of our universe, and that everything from there outwards has to be fireproof or fire smart, and the farther out you go, the less you have to be concerned about it. And I can't help but to think about some of the stratas around where the houses are all put close together, and I think, well, they're within those boundaries already. Even if you got rid of all the plants, what would you do? And so I guess what we would do is put sprinklers on the roofs, right? Which would help tremendously. We've seen that be a complete success. But these different zones around the houses, they're saying, that the 1.5 meters, about 6 feet around the house shouldn't be anything. It should be like a zero landscaping, not xeriscaping, and not zero-scaping, which isn't a word, but actual, just basically gravel, I guess is what it boils down to. Grass like turf is funny because it really doesn't burn. You have to water it. That's the issue, is it uses a lot of water. But it doesn't really burn when it's green and maintained and mowed. And as you get farther out from the building, you're allowed more and more things. And the ultimate thing, we're going to talk a little bit about it today, about the approach to how to landscape. Like I'm mentioning a couple of plants today, but it's not really about individual plants. It's about the system, what we have to think about, and what's going to be recommended, what's likely going to happen, or the direction we have to go as we move into the future. So, some of the basic things that they talk about is, remove fuel for wildfires from around the exterior of your home. And obviously, going around the entire area, gutters are one of the things that we often forget about, because pine needles and that sort of thing end up in there, and leaves. And in the Okanagan, those areas get quite parched and dry. Like in coastal areas, it does in the summertime there, but even right now, like we haven't had any precipitation for probably at least a month or so, or somewhere around there. But if I go up and check my gutters, they're bone dry. And you can see the material in there, so clean them out, keeping those areas clean of debris, and just basically keeping your landscapes tidy and cleaning up everything basically. Obvious things, I think, like firewood storage, any material that's going to be sitting in a pile, we just don't want it anywhere near our houses. I just keep seeing those. I don't know if, I live out in Lake Country, and we were watching the fire burning on TV across the lake, and then all of a sudden we just looked up on the hillside and we said, there's a fire starting right there. And this is I don't know how many kilometers away from the main fire it was, but it was just an amber that came across and dropped. Next thing you know, that whole hillside was on fire. And so, as we experience these things, we suddenly have this heightened awareness, right? And so we don't leave piles of stuff around. That's basically it. So in the old days, I can remember as a kid, we used to stack all our firewood up against the house because it was closest. we heated our house with wood, so we didn't want to have to go out there, especially in the wintertime, go across the yard or whatever to go get wood. That didn't make any sense. You wanted it either in your basement or you wanted it very close to where you could access it. But that's no longer a recommended thing. Of course, I can't remember ever in my entire life having somebody's house burned down, very rarely from a forest fire. Can't really remember ever hearing that till recently, till 2003. Pruning of branches away from your roof. They say they don't want any branches within 6 feet of your building, like even branches that stick out. So it's that's kind of hard. I think a lot of our properties are fairly small. We have a lot of trees and plants and all kinds of cool things. And that minimum 6 feet where nothing can be within that area. It's hard to grasp that, at least for me it is anyway. But what else can we do? The wooden fences or hedges that could create a conduit for a fire, and that's what they call the ladder fuel. And ladder fuel is a bad thing because that's just where you have a fence, and the fence runs from your property line to your house, and sometimes you'll have that sort of segregating. cutting your property in half and the fence comes right to your house. It happens to be a wooden fence. So of course, you know what happens then is the fire gets on the fence and it just wicks its way right along until it hits your house. So they want all that to be metal now. They don't want that to be wood anymore. And even having a metal gate, if you had a wooden fence, you have to put in a gate. They want a metal gate because it creates a break somewhere along the way. And obviously, you know, the different types of surface mulches as well play a bit of a role as well. Not as much, but it depends on when you have types of mulches. And a mulch, remember, is a surface covering. It's put on the surface of the ground to suppress weed growth and hold moisture and all that kind of thing. So mulch, that's the definition of mulch. So with mulches, you can use rock, you can use spark mulch, you can use compost, you can use all kinds of different products. But some are really flammable. And bark particularly, especially Douglas fir bark, if you pick up Douglas fir bark, you get pitch all over your hands. If anybody knows, pitch is extremely flammable. So you really don't want to be using bark mulch. The compost mulch, like we have Nature's Gold here in the valley, and because again we're in a desert climate or semi-arid desert, that can dry out quite intensively. And so it becomes just literally like crispy, crunchy, but it'll actually catch on fire eventually, but it's kind of hard to get going. I actually saw a planting where there was electrical wires that ran through the planting, and they were actually buried in the Nature's Gold mulch. And they had been shorting out for about a month. And over a month of shorting, where you could actually see the sparking. And after a month, it had actually started to burn a spot about 2 feet in diameter. But still, I was quite surprised, like 2 feet, like you'd think the thing would have just burned. It would have just caught on fire and started, But no, it was less of an issue. So when things are composted, they don't completely lose their flammability, but they just are slightly less flammable. But other types of mulches, like rock mulch, are really the way to go, especially near your buildings. So right now we may have no mulch, we may have composty mulch, we might have who knows what, but they really want you to go with rock mulch because that is the least flammable. But remember that landscape fabrics, like the woven landscape fabric that everybody uses, is extremely flammable. It's actually made of a petroleum product, and that stuff burns like holy. One time I was over at Byland's Nurseries across the lake, and I was helping with the installation of these big greenhouses there, and we were rolling out this landscape fabric on the floors, which we use like a carpeting material in greenhouses to put plants on. And we were there and we were discussing, they wanted to know, well, how do you know how much, what kind of fans you need? How do you know? It's like, well, it's easy calculation. You just need one air exchange in your greenhouse per minute. So how would you ever know that? Well, you turn your fans on and you light a piece of paper, and then you put the paper out, you get this cloud of smoke, and then you time it, how long it takes to go out the fans at the far end. And that tells you, how long it takes in 1 minute that smoke has to exit. Anyway, we were doing an experiment, and the guy there lit the paper on fire and dropped it on the floor on the landscape fabric, which is like gasoline, and it just went whoo. A little bit of a fire, so we managed to put it out. But it burnt an area about 12 feet by about 6 feet wide in about maybe just 30 seconds. So we do have to, I'm not sure how landscape fabric burns when it's underneath rock. Good question. So we need to find that out. But other things that we're talking about is conifers, any kind of conifer like cedars or cypresses or fir trees or spruces or pines are not recommended because they have a very high percentage of like a turpentine type flammable pitch. It's very, very flammable. And they tend to burn. They produce a lot of dry needles, that sort of thing, which can be an issue. And so they say select non-coniferous plants. So a conifer is any tree or plant that produces a cone as a flower, rather than a flower, it produces a cone. So it's a fairly small group ultimately, but they're very common in landscaping. They're also fairly drought tolerant, a lot of them. So we do see a lot of different conifers in our landscapes. So selecting deciduous trees or deciduous plants are the choice, herbaceous plants, and if you want evergreens, you have to use broadleaf evergreens. Now, if you were down in Vancouver, you would have this huge long list of all these broadleaf evergreens that you could use for hedging or for shrubbery. There's just all kinds of broadleaf evergreens. So that literally means that the leaf is just like a regular tree leaf, but it doesn't fall off in the wintertime. It just stays as an evergreen leaf. And so there are a lot in Vancouver and not so many here in the Okanagan, because if you have your leaves exposed all winter, you're going to be subject to freezing and cold temperatures and that sort of thing. Now, we have boxwoods, that's pretty good, they're awesome, drought tolerant, deer resistant, a lot of advantages to growing boxwoods, and they're fine. Also the, some rhododendrons, we have some success with rhododendrons, pyracantha, but we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So the other basic things, the debris, keeping the debris cleaned up and plants hydrated. So again, we were talking about how a lawn can be quite actually burn resistant. Like it's hard to burn a lawn. It's not possible, but it's hard to burn a lawn because it's so moist and wet. It's got to be watered to keep it alive and growing. So if you have a dead lawn, that's going to be a fire hazard. But if you have a lawn that's nice and hydrated, it's probably fine. Or the other option is xeriscape and change to all dryland plants and get rid of the lawn altogether. So the big question with all this talk about fire and everything is why? Why are we dealing with this right now? What does this all mean? What's happening out there? And it's really one thing, and it's just basically evaporation. So evaporation, as you may all know, is a simple process. If you put a bowl of water out at night and you come back in the morning and it's this much shallower than it was in the morning, the water's evaporated out of it. If you boil water, it evaporates really rapidly and disappears, goes into the atmosphere. And it turns into clouds eventually, so that's part of the process. But in nature we have these cycles where the water moves, it comes from the clouds as rainfall, it percolates into the earth and it runs down rivers into lakes and streams and eventually into the ocean. And then it evaporates. The evaporation is continuous everywhere and it recycles and goes back and basically does it again. They say we have the same amount of water now that we had, a million years ago. So that hasn't changed, it just keeps recycling. So with this process, you'll see the precipitation, and then the runoff comes off the surface, the percolation goes through the soil, and infiltration is another word for that, and then it gets down into that groundwater, and then it gets into rivers and everything. But the plants, amazing thing with plants is they transpire, and that just means they suck the water up through the roots through osmosis. This is where it gets more sciencey, but so osmosis brings the water into the plant, and then the water evaporates out of the foliage through these little stomata, which are little vents that open and close, and then the water evaporates back up into the atmosphere. So one of the things that, like when most of the moisture and humidity comes off the ocean and it comes onto land, and then it drops within a few hundred miles of the coastline, and then the plants absorb it again and they take it up and they transpire it back into the atmosphere again, and it moves over and it drops again, and then those plants absorb it and then it evaporates again, and you have this cycle where the water's moving across Canada bit by bit, and typically in one direction. Not always, but mostly. So the big question is, it's really just about this, the one thing when it comes to temperature and humidity and moisture. One of the first things when we went to horticulture school is we had to understand humidity. So they gave us swing synchrometers and they made us go outside and we'd swing these things around, and it gave you a mathematical equation that you could put into your system and calculate what the humidity was. And so they said, this is really critical. This is one of the most important things, in horticulture. You have to understand how water works and how the air holds humidity. And then I really learned a lot about that when I had greenhouses. So when you have a greenhouse, you're fighting humidity continuously. It's way too humid in there. So you're always trying to figure out, well, how can I get the humidity out of this greenhouse? And people say, well, you gotta heat it up. So you heat it up, and then the hotter the air gets, the more water it holds, which is a really cool thing to know. If you didn't know that, that's number one. So in a greenhouse, what we do is we heat it up a bit, and then the air expands, and it holds way more moisture. So it sucks all the moisture out of the plants, off the floors, takes it off the inside of the plastic. You know, sometimes it's literally raining in a greenhouse, which is really bad for diseases of plants. So we heat it up to get all the water into the atmosphere, into the air, and then we blast it outside with the fans and replace it with cold air. And then the cold air comes in and it slowly heats up again, and it heats up, and it takes on more and more moisture, and then you blast it outside. So why is this all relevant? It's because this is exactly what happens as temperatures increase. You hear people saying, oh, it's going to be 1.5 degrees Celsius more, or it can't exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, whatever their statistics are. And people are going, 1.5 degrees, like that's nothing. Like this morning it was plus 10 degrees Celsius, and now it's 45 degrees Celsius. It's like, that's way more than 1 degree. It's like, yeah, climate is different than weather, right? So weather is what happens today. Climate is what happens over 100 years or 200 years. And so what happens with this atmosphere is that the atmosphere is warming, and they're tracking the temperature. So what do they say about 2024, right? Hottest year of all time, exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's kind of interesting, because they're saying we can't exceed that before 2050. It's like, yeah, I think we're zooming past that one. But what happens is the atmosphere holds more and more and more and more water. So just like in a greenhouse, one of the factors was that when we'd heat up the atmosphere in the greenhouses, the plants would all dry out. So we'd have to be watering more. And so the more we watered, the more water we were introducing. You know, it's this vicious cycle. Well, when you're outside and the atmosphere is sucking all the water out, it's sucking it out of everything. It's sucking it out of your roof, sucking it out of the lawns, sucking it especially out of the plants. Firewood. Like in the 70s, I was a mad firewood guy because I was a kid, and we used to chop firewood all the time. We had our whole driveway was about 80 feet long, and it was stacked with firewood, 3 rows deep, about 6 feet high, and that was my work. I chopped all that. It was my job. But we used to heat with wood, so it was one of those things. But you know, we always had a hard time. This was out in the East Kootenays. We had a hard time finding dry wood. It was just one of those things, like we'd find a good tree, but it was still kind of green, you know, see, it would never burn, you could never get the thing to light. So sometimes we'd be able to cut it down, cut it into pieces and stack it for a year or two. Usually 2 years was really nice. You could get really nice dry firewood if you let it ripen for a couple of years. 1 year was the bare minimum though, for sure. Nowadays, I think if you took that wood and split it up, put it in a pile green, I'd be checking that in about 3 months, maybe 4 months, just to see like, oh, it's getting pretty dry. I think we could start to burn that now. That's the difference that I've noticed since the 70s. It's just this incredible rate of evaporation. The earth, as the earth gets slightly warmer, and it's just in the decimals, tiny, tiny increases. What happens is the air can just hold more moisture. So you put out a bowl, it evaporates faster. Like I always knew when I came to Kelowna the first time in 86, and it would pour rain out, you know, it was pouring rain. And then it was about 2 hours later, you couldn't even tell it rained. Like I'd go out there and I'd go like, it's totally bone dry, the roads are dry. It's just evaporated away, which I never saw that in other climates. You know, I thought that was kind of unique. Well, now it can be pouring rain and within like an hour, the roads are dry. So that's just my personal observation. I mean, obviously it rains hard and more continuous, but when you get a downpour, it certainly doesn't last very long. So this is what we're up against. So people say, well, how about the fires? What's different than a fire from 1950 or a fire from 1970 or a fire from 2015 or a fire from 2024? Well, when I drive, one thing that I can do as a horticulturist, I can spot plant problems from a long distance away. And one of the things that I see when I drive through forests is a lot of the plants are under moisture stress. They're all showing signs of moisture stress. And I mean the entire forest. And I'm thinking, well, I guess that sort of makes sense with this heating climate and everything. The plants are drying out real quick and the needles are starting to go gray color, like they're showing stress. So, it's happening everywhere. It's one of these things. We just have to get used to it. So these fires, when they burn quick, they burn hot, way, way faster than ever before. And I don't have to, I have to prevent the fires from starting. I can remember as a kid, we couldn't get a fire to start. We would go and we'd have to hunt for the driest twigs and we'd try to make a fire. We got really good at building fires because we were always out in the bush camping, fishing, that sort of thing. But what I would do is I would find the driest twigs under these big trees and little tiny ones and just make a big pile of them, and then you could light a fire right away, no problem. But you couldn't light a fire with a stick that was, 3/4 of an inch diameter. There just seemed to be this constant, even in the dry wood, there was a certain amount of humidity. I don't find that anymore, actually. I just find that the wood is so dry you can light it with a cigarette lighter. So the slight change in temperature makes a big difference. Just slight, I mean 0.0001 degree makes a big difference when you're talking billions and billions and billions of gallons of water that are held in the atmosphere. So the other aspect of that is that the warmer it gets, the more water the atmosphere holds. So it gets full of water, and then when it gets really full, it just dumps it all at once. So when it rains, it really rains. And when it snows, it really snows, and it often will flood. So it's just interesting how that's kind of come around. The higher the temperature, the more water the atmosphere holds, and it acts like a vacuum pulling water out of plants and objects. So big difference since the 70s, as we just talked about. Today's climate means everything is acting fast. So again, we get a ton of snow. People say, well, right now we're at 85% of our snowpack right now, and we've still got a ways to go. So we could be up at 120% of our snowpack. So that'd be awesome. We got all that water up there. Problem is, everything happens fast now. So that extra snow up there is just going to melt fast. So it used to last till July 1st. In July, you could still go up and potentially do skiing up there in the summertime. But no more. By the time you hit the end of April into May, that snow is melting quick and it's coming down. So we have flooding as a result of that. More and more floods. So, snow melt, evaporation, transpiration. So transpiration is that's where plants evaporate. So with this, we talk a lot about water conservation and, play your part, be water smart, save it or do without it. And, I think every community is talking about this. There's a big cost in moving water around, but ultimately it's you have to conserve, right? We just have to conserve. So that'll be something that, you'll hear a lot of. So you'll be hearing a lot more about it because things are getting more strict out there, and for good reason. So biggest water usages other than agriculture. So agriculture is the biggest water user, but it's for food production. So we assume that that's going to happen. But irrigation, especially regular households, irrigation is a big issue. Water features, if you want water to evaporate really fast, just heat up a bunch of rocks in the sun and then run water over it. It evaporates super fast. Or take the water and shoot it up into the air and see if it evaporates faster that way. So water features do cause a lot of, and they leak like crazy, So leaks in the systems is one of the things. So water features often leak, they spill, or they splash, and so they can be an issue. But leaks in systems like irrigation systems are a big issue. And we're going to look at that here shortly. And we'll talk about what that looks like, what leaks in systems looks like. So unknowing humans is one of the big wasters. So that's where we turn the tap on and walk away and forget about it. we're outside, we're working on it. Oh, geez, that's that water running. So we come running back in, we shut it off, and it's been running for an hour down the drain. So that can be an issue. But there's lots of other things. Sometimes your toilet just runs. It's just got this continuous running sometimes you even know it, but you don't get it fixed, or it's such a small amount. Does it really matter? You know, it's just a tiny little bit. My toilet's running on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, and then the evaporation, which we've been talking a lot about evaporation, you know, as being, you know, I just recall with swimming pools, we've always been involved in landscaping, and which has to do a lot with swimming pools and that sort of thing. But swimming pools will lose sometimes a half an inch of water a day, like every day. And that's just evaporation, and it has to do something with the photons, actual light hitting the water that causes the water to evaporate really quickly off of flat surfaces, which water is super flat. But anyway, what these leaks add up to is quite amazing, really, when you start. I always talk in gallons because being in the irrigation industry, everything's in gallons because of mostly because of the U.S. because everything there is in gallons and feet. Even though these are imperial gallons, so a gallon here is 5 liters in Canada, the imperial gallon. And so 1 gallon per minute. So if you can imagine, 1 gallon per minute is not a huge amount of water. It's not enough. Most of your irrigation systems, like residential irrigation, runs at about 10 gallons per minute per zone. So if you want to know how much water your yard uses, it's very simple. You add up all the times of your run, all your run times, so 10 minutes, 15, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever the times are, and then each zone gets 10 gallons per minute or less, but it's not supposed to exceed 10 minutes, or 10 gallons per minute. So you can just do the math on that and see how many gallons you use. Typical household might be 1,600 gallons in an evening. Could be 1,200. Larger properties, they'll have up to 12 zones, 15 zones. I have a property that we manage, it's 60 zones. And so if you try to figure that one out, every zone runs for an hour because it has to. They're all huge zones. So that's a lot of watering. And a lot of gallons, and those are on bigger pipes that use way more water. But for residential, about 10 gallons per minute is what you're allowed to have per zone. If you have 5 zones, you're running 50 gallons per minute. So you just add up the minutes, multiply by 50. So 1 gallon per minute a leak, and the reason I use this is because I went to somebody's property, this was about 2 years ago, and I was fixing a few sprinkler heads that they had problems with. But he said, hey, well, while you're here, that valve box over there is full of water. And I said, well, that's not good. Something's got to be wrong there. And he said, yeah, would you mind fixing it while you're here? And I said, sure, I'll have a look at it. So I go over, and sure enough, the valve box was full of water. And I said, well, how long has it been full of water? He says, oh, gee, it's been full of water since we moved here. I said, it's been full of water since you moved here. When did you move here? It was 7 years ago. 7 years ago, okay? All right, so I started digging the thing out, and I found that the main line that goes into where the valves are, that's live water, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, was not glued in, was never glued. So the water pouring out of there would have been about probably 2 gallons a minute, a lot. Like it was, you could see the water moving in the valve box, but it was just draining away because it was kind of gravelly soil. So I was thinking, oh boy, I better do the math on this. Okay, well, let's see. Well, there's 2 gallons a minute for 60 minutes in an hour, and there's, you do the math. And then that would add, if it was 2 gallons a minute, it would add up to double what this is. So, but 1 gallon a minute is not a huge amount of water, and I do find, I come across properties, like if you walk across somebody's lawn and you're like, splash, 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 that's a lot of water. That is not 1 gallon a minute. That's like 4 gallons a minute. Constant flow, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I find properties like that quite often. And then we have to tell people, like, did you know that your system's running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Oh, we knew it seemed kind of wet. It's like, yeah, it's kind of wet. So I was talking about leaks and how a lot of the water that goes underground, and often either you don't see it or people just don't deal with it. But you can see how 1 gallon a minute equals 60 gallons per hour, equals 1,440 gallons per day, equals 10,080 gallons per week, 43,200 gallons per month, and 280,800 gallons in a 6.5 month season. That's 1,404,000 liters. And can you imagine a guy who his ran for 7 years, and you can only count the 6.5 months because we're in a temperate climate, or we have seasons. So this is just a tremendous amount of water. And when I say water, I often say money. But when you're on it, can you imagine, like, when the stratas, maybe one day they'll end up getting metered and have to pay by the usage. And my feeling is that's coming sooner rather than later. And if that does happen, that this is one property. This isn't like 10 properties. This is one property, right? So can you imagine, like, if you had 200 units or something, what are the odds of there being more than that leaking? Probably pretty good. So the way you figure it out, and this is the way it's got to go eventually in the future, is that you need to have each individual area or valve box metered. So the meters they're private meters, and they're hooked up to a system where you can track it, and then you can see how many liters of water you use per week or per month. And then if you see an anomaly, so you'd say, well, a normal function for this property is 20,000 gallons a week or a month, and all of a sudden it's 60,000. You got to investigate, right? Figure it out. So that's how you do it. The question is like, how many, that's the problem is some of the stratas have like one massive zone that's huge, or that, it's really hard to track down where the leak would be. But even with a meter like this, you can look at those things and shut all the system off and look to see if the little needle spins. Like it's still spinning, the water is running. The other thing you can do is you can use a stethoscope. And so I use stethoscopes for irrigation all the time. I just go to Princess Auto, they have the inexpensive mechanics stethoscope, and you can just touch it on things, you can hear what's going on inside. That's a good, you can't do irrigation without one of those, right? And so the first thing people say, like, oh, I think my valve's leaking. So you have a bunch of valves in a valve box, so you put your stethoscope on and you touch it on this one and that one and this one, and then it's that one. You pull it out, open it up, little tiny pebble inside of that. And that's just running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So other things that are water relation related, really, I always think, if somebody's a gardener, they have to be aware of the plant's needs, and also just be cognizant of the fact that the plants are either dry or wet or whatever they are. So that's something really important. If your gardener doesn't know that, they're not much of a gardener. The newly planted versus old established plants, that's huge when it comes to watering. If you have an area where the plants have been for years and years, they've been planted for 30 years, they don't need much water at all. Like, they've got their water sources. They don't need to be babied anymore. They're established. Even cedars, they've been there for years. I know huge cedar hedges around Kelowna that haven't been watered in 20 years, and they're still okay. They're still growing because they're so old and established. Their roots have found ways of finding water. This whole thing with newly planted. Now, newly planted plants, their roots are right there, right at the base of the plant. So they're not searching for 30 feet around, or 20 feet, or 10 feet, or 5 feet. They're only searching an area about 6 inches around. And so that plant is going to use all that water in that area pretty much every day or two, if it's in the summertime especially. So newly planted plants need water all the time. But sooner or later, somebody's got to shut the system off because they're no longer newly planted. They've been in for a year or two, so let's let them grow their roots out and find water. So watering excessively when plants are new is important. That's how you get them to establish. But once they're established, you got to wean them off this thing. In civilizations and in cities, we tend to teach plants how to grow because plants are really smart. They have memory. So they remember things, which this has been proven now for many years. The thing that they're remembering now is that it's going to water. My irrigation system is watering every 2 days, every second day it's going to water. And in nature, they would never get it every 2 days, especially lawns. Lawns, they're prairie plants. Does it rain every day on the prairies, really? No. So in our landscapes, we tend to run by a clock that runs very specifically. So then we're running every second day, every second day, every second day. And the lawn actually has to adjust to that. It's like, wow, this is pretty wet. This is like constantly soggy. So I have to adapt. So they start growing these really white fibrous roots that are designed to live underwater. If you've ever rooted a cutting in a glass and you see those big white beautiful roots that come out, those are water roots, right? Those are roots. You don't see those roots existing above or in soils that, especially if they dry out, those little fibers, little hairs would just be gone in no time. So this is what happens with a lot of plants in our landscapes is we water them way too much, especially once they're well established. So they just develop these roots that are demanding of that water because we've taught them how to live with water that's very, very consistent. So what I say is the same thing I say whether it's a house plant or your lawn or a tree is when you water, water well, but then don't water again until the plant needs it. And that's a challenge when it comes to outdoor landscapes and seasonal changes and all that stuff. So that's where, observing plants for their water needs and general health is always important. And ideally the plants are planted in hydrozones. So that's where, again, the plant knowledge out there is lacking. There's no doubt about it. Not a lot of people know, that this is that plant and it came from here, so it needs a lot of water. This is this plant and it came from dry areas. You have to know what that plant's requirements are. And a hydrozone is an area that's designed just for plants of a specific water requirement. So let's say we had plants like, we had some beautiful hydrangeas, and they're lovely, they're the water-loving hydrangeas, because there's also dry-loving hydrangeas as well. But let's say we get the water-loving ones, and we had them, and they're beautiful, and our whole landscape is xeriscaped, but we have this nice little spot in the shade, put in some beautiful hydrangeas, and just water that. That's a hydrozone. So I'll put in some ferns maybe, and some other plants that like those conditions, right? So that little hydrozone, we only have one zone like that in our whole property. The rest of the property is pretty dry. So that's a hydrozone. And so that's the other thing, if you know your plants, especially for landscape designing, you automatically do that, right? You wouldn't put your desert plants in with plants that need a lot of water. That wouldn't make any sense. But, however, we don't see a lot of plant knowledge out there, so keep learning. That's all I keep saying. So if plants are found to be dry in the landscape, say from a maintenance standpoint, trickle a hose, at the base of the plant or somewhere near the plant, and let that trickle and soak in slowly while you're maybe doing other things. So you don't have to stand there and watch it. You just put it on a drip, so it's just dripping, and leave it for an hour or so. Come back. So a drip would probably be about 0.01%. Gallons per minute. So it's not very much water. We're talking about gallons per minute, trying to understand what is 1 gallon per minute. We should get something that we can use in a demonstration that we can just turn on and it runs at 1 gallon per minute. That'd probably be useful. So how much water? The importance of deep watering. So when we water well. And sometimes when you have to water slowly. So a lot of things are turning into drip lines in our landscapes. So they use drip lines, and the drip lines will drip, and they'll soak into the ground really deep and really slowly, and the water doesn't have a chance to evaporate because it's not being shot up into the air first before it hits the ground. So drip lines are really a great thing, but somebody's got to understand how they function, right? And what's the idea, and what's the spacing on these drip lines? One of the big mistakes we see in landscaping is that people will plant a tree in here and there, and they'll run a line that goes along, and it'll have like 1 or sometimes 2 little drips right at the base of the tree, and then another 10-foot section with no drips, and then 2 drips at the base of the tree. And this could be okay for establishing a tree, but it's not going to help it in the future because trees' roots look like this. They're like at the base of a wine glass. They're very shallow, but very wide spreading. And so we need to cover that whole root system with moisture. And it's hard to do. With a drip line you can, but you need a grid. You need a grid system. So, and then how long does that run? Well, I use a soil probe. I have a probe I put in the ground, and I pull it out and I go, oh, the water, it's been running for an hour and it's only 6 inches deep. Better run it for 2 hours because these plants' roots are 12 inches deep. Okay, so just through practical methods, you can figure out how long to water things. So then as soon as you notice that there's a problem, tell somebody. That's really important. And irrigation fixes as you go for maintenance people is really important too. Or at very least, they're the guys who are looking at everything really up close. Not always, but let's say they should be looking at it up close. And they should go, you know what, that last week we were here and that whole area was bone dry. We came back this week and it's still bone dry. That area's not getting water. Who's your irrigation guy? I'm just letting you know there's a problem there. See ya, gotta get back to work, right? That's the minimum requirement, I would say. So again, the thing with water features, there's different types of water features, but they do use a lot of water. Water features always have this constant evaporation rate, and these types of, this is a bubbling rock system, which is, it doesn't have any actual water that's exposed other than the water that's on the rocks. The problem with bubbling rocks is the water hits the rocks and splashes. And this one, the rocks around this are way too small for that height. So the higher the rock, the bigger the circle area needs to be. So, but when it's hot out in the summertime, those rocks, they get smoking hot. And of course the water just evaporates off them, so you need an auto refill. So each of these water features has a bubble, like a toilet bowl float. And when it goes down to a certain point, turns on again, it comes up, and then shuts off. And so that's called an auto refill. And if it's a little unit like this, absolutely necessity, you must have auto refill. Bigger systems definitely have auto refills. So again, the more you splash water around, the more it goes down waterfalls, or if it's a river that just runs through a pattern, through a trench or through like a riverbed, it's not as bad. But as soon as you introduce waterfalls and splashing water, you get a lot of water usage. And I would like to try to figure out one day which is worse, irrigation, excessive uses, or water features. So just back to maintenance again here for a second, is that the general maintenance on a property plays a big role when it comes to water conservation and fire smarting too, right? So people are going to be, or hopefully are going to be looking at the property from a management standpoint, and hopefully, dealing with irrigation issues. So they're going to look and see when they have these irrigation issues and deal with them, or have somebody deal with them. The cleaning of surfaces is a common process that happens, and with this, they'll often be weeding cracks in the driveways and weeding the beds, and then all the surfaces get cleaned off and blown off, and all that debris is removed. So the one nice thing when you do have a maintenance company that's doing work is that typically the property is pretty spotless, and you don't end up with debris piling up anywhere, and especially behind sheds and that sort of thing, which can be a fire hazard. Hopefully the pruning is being done properly. Some deadheading that's done on perennials is something that happens. And remember that deadheading is preventing the plant from becoming a weed. People say, oh, that plant's so weedy. It's like, well, were you deadheading it? And they say, well, no. And I go, well, that's the problem, because they do develop thousands of seeds every year, so those seeds end up spreading everywhere. So somebody's job is to be deadheading that. If it's a maintenance company, they have to know to deadhead those because they're invasive. But non-invasive if you remove the seed heads. So again, pruning, deadheading, general plant health care. So if people do know a little bit about plant health care, they'll be able to look at a plant and say, that plant is dry, that plant is got a disease, this plant has got excessive dead wood in it, and the dead wood needs to be removed. So fertilizing keeps plants healthy and lush, which is anti-fire, and proper lawn care, it makes all the difference. And water feature management is really important, because it's a common thing that I hear, like I'll do consulting and go to people's properties and they'll tell me all their problems and issues, and we go around solving all those issues, and then they go, oh yeah, the pond. For some reason my pond is just continuously filling. Like I've got an auto refill on it, and it just, you can see it's running all the time. Okay, well, it's losing water, typically on the waterfall part itself, and it's sneaking out over a rock and getting out beyond the liner. We just have to find the location, put a rock under that, and generally that's solved. Or there can be some other issues as well. But that's just, again, if somebody's paying attention, they would see that. And as soon as I would just say that with water features, as soon as you see a problem, deal with it. Because you could be losing a heck of a lot of water and not really be aware of it. So types of plants that are recommended, are obviously drought-tolerant plants. And because drought-tolerant plants, that's where it's at. Once they're established, you don't have to water them as much. And if you forget to water them, or let's say the water gets shut off, like I've heard in areas down the coast where they don't have as many drought-tolerant plants as we do. But when Vancouver runs out of water, they tell them, like, no watering. That's it. No watering outside. So, like, okay, well, not even sneak out a bucket of water for your plants. But, so if you're picking drought-tolerant plants that are grown in the earth and whatnot, they're going to survive even if it gets dry. Less flammable plants, so that again, we don't want any conifers, so non-coniferous plants. And you definitely, plants that tend, this is kind of a little bit of a controversy for me, is that most drought-tolerant plants have a very high resin level in their foliage, full of oils and things, and their foliage tends to be fuzzy, so it's silvery looking. So sometimes there's something, if you see a plant that's silver in color, it's probably drought tolerant. Because it's silver, those are little fine hairs that grow on the leaves that keep the plant from losing excessive moisture. And so when you see that, when you have those drought tolerant plants and they have those really high resins in their foliage, you smell it. It smells really nice. It's got a nice herbal smell. It could be like mint, or it could be like lavender, or it could be like Russian sage, or real culinary sage. A lot of these plants are all drought tolerant, they're all tough, but those high resin levels actually burn pretty good too. They're oil, right? They have a lot of oil in them. And so I was reading in one of the guidelines, the BC Fire Smart guidelines, it says try to avoid plants that have high resin levels in their foliage. But select drought-tolerant plants. I'm going like, okay, that's a tough one. But so, for me, the ultimate thing with plants is try to keep your plants low. Don't let them get big. Don't pick big plants in the first place. Keep small plants. So not too tall. That's the next thing. So yeah. So if you have shrubs nowadays, the new plants that are out there are fabulous. They have tons of. You used to be able to get these beauty bushes, Colquitzia. Huge shrubs, like 10, 12 feet high, beautiful, bloom and everything, but real papery bark. So you don't really want papery bark because that will burn pretty easy. But now you can get dwarfer forms that stay much smaller, so that's better. Other plants, dwarf forms are available, so you can get smaller plants. So one of the things that we're going to be looking for is more dwarf type of plants, and deciduous is ideal. So cosmetically pleasing is one of the things that's sort of a necessity. So colorful foliage or flowers, that sort of thing. When it comes to evergreens, like I'm not totally thinking that, like say we say, don't plant spruces, but there are little miniature spruces that don't get higher than 1 foot higher or 2 feet in diameter. That little tiny spruce, I don't think it's going to be a fire hazard. So I think that thing, as long as they're spaced fairly far apart, you can use it. When you're doing landscaping and landscape designing, it's really nice to have a little bit of evergreen for winter, so that the landscape looks like something. Looks like somebody's still living there. So one of the things that people are asking a lot about is the attraction to pollinators, and of course a lot of the native plants are great for that because the pollinators of the warmer climate, they're definitely going to be having the local pollinators looking for food, and they're going to identify those first. I sort of missed well-behaved because I was talking about dwarf plants. Dwarf plants are surprisingly well-behaved. You just put them in, and that's it. No hedge trimming, no nothing. Just let them grow. Maybe after 5 or 10 years you have to do something with it. Not much. Okay, so deer resistant is nice. You don't always get that with the native plants. Some of the native plants are natural deer browse, so it's but still they're really good. The broadleaf evergreens is something that they're trying for. There's a small selection we can grow here in the Okanagan, lots in coastal regions. So the bad conifers. So conifers, again, these are plants that develop cones. That's how they reproduce. So instead of having a flower, like a flowering plant, they have a cone. And the cone is similar. It has some parts that are like a flower. They'll get pollinated, and then within the cone, they'll produce a seed. The seed drops, and it grows. So things like cedars, which we know, we look out any window in Kelowna, you'll see cedars, most likely. Cypresses, which look like a cedar, very similar. Junipers, which also look like a cypress, but they are very drought tolerant, deer resistant, a lot of them, but they're still on the naughty list right now. But again, there's different types of junipers, spreading ones that grow on the ground, right? And there are some that are very tiny little dwarf guys. Again, I don't think the dwarf plants are really in that category of being, fire starters. Pines, of course, all the different types of pines. We live in a forest of ponderosa pines, which are considered quite actually fire resistant. The needles drop, the needles will burn. The bark is not really burnable very much, and generally it's quite thick. So it's one of the few trees that's actually quite fire resistant. And we're not talking about a 100-foot high wall of fire going in a 60-mile-an-hour wind. We're just talking about fires on the ground like a normal fire. They are fire resistant, but they produce a lot of needles, and not all pines are created equally. A lot of pines are quite flammable. Firs is a different group. We don't have many firs here other than the Douglas fir, which is not a fir at all. But and they're not really as bad, but Douglas firs produce a lot of sap, and that's one of the problems with them. So they do actually become quite a fire hazard. Spruces, they're spruces. When you grab a fir tree by the needles, it's soft. When you grab a spruce tree by the needles, it's sticking directly into your hand, and you need to pull them out like needles. So that's how you identify them. If they're prickly, they're spruce. If they're soft, they're fir. Yew trees also are a fire hazard. So those are the bad guys. And just on the good guys category here, so conifers. There's just a few, and people may not even know that they are conifers, because they're, ginkgo is one thing, ginkgo biloba, everybody knows that, or they can remember it. Get it? That's a joke. The ginkgo is one of the things that take for your memory, apparently, ginkgo biloba. But anyway, ginkgo is a super tough tree. It's deciduous, it's a conifer. It loses its leaves in the wintertime. But it's an interesting tree. It has no known pests or diseases. So that's kind of a good thing. And quite drought tolerant, not bad, and good tree. So you can't just block out all conifers. And larches are also deciduous. So this is a needled tree that will drop its needles in the fall, and they're good to go again the next year, growing new needles. So larch is a good one. The dwarf conifers, like I say, as long as they're spaced apart, you can get there's thousands of different types of dwarf conifers. The thing with the dwarf conifer is that they are pricey. So when you go to buy them, the shock scares people because you buy a shrub and you go, oh, this shrub is $20 or $30 and it's a decent size. And if it's a dwarf conifer, you don't get much for $30, right? It's just tiny because it goes by age. They're very slow growing. So you have to buy bigger ones that cost a lot of money, hundreds of dollars sometimes. So yeah, good choice. But not if you're doing a budget landscape. You're probably not going to want to do dwarf conifers. Pyracantha, which is a firethorn shrub, is one of these things that is something that is a good one to grow. It's a broadleaf evergreen, has humongous thorns, so it's self-protecting. And it's got orange berries on it, white flowers in the spring. Boxwoods, common throughout the valley. Everywhere, different types of boxwoods, pros and cons with each, but ultimately pretty good. Quite drought tolerant, easy to grow, can be hedge trimmed, and not too bad. The rhododendrons are fine, and they're classified as one of the better plants to grow for us here. We can grow probably about 10 different types of rhododendrons here quite easily in the valley. We just need to prepare the soil. We can't just dig a hole in our rocky clay type soil. We have to have actual soil. So something that would represent or resemble garden soil. So we often in landscaping have to buy our soils blended because in the Okanagan we don't really have any real good topsoil to speak of. So they would require a decent topsoil, but they're actually pretty tough and survive the cold, no problem. The cold is not the issue, it's the soil type that's the issue. So like I say, we have about 10 varieties that are pretty good. Most of them are larger plants though, and that's a problem. So this list could be reduced down pretty small really quick. There's probably only 1 or 2 that are going to be small enough to stay under, that 3 to 4 foot height. That really is what they want. No shrubbery getting much bigger than that. Russian laurel is one. That's Prunus laurocerasus. And this particular one from Russia is quite tough, and it's got beautiful shiny leaves. It grows down on the coast. They use them for hedges everywhere. What we'd have to do here is we've had similar, there's 2 different Russian laurels. We tried one, and we grew it for 15 years without any issues, and then last winter, when that severe cold came, killed it right to the ground, and it was like 20 feet high. Beautiful, big, green, lush leaves, really nice hedge. But yeah, so now the trick is we go away from that particular one and try the other one and make it through a tough winter like we've had in the last 2 years. When it goes beyond -30, all bets are off. Russian laurel, I just talked about that. Daphnes, there's a bunch of different daphnes. Not really a great plant. Some of them are actually getting quite invasive, and they seed all over the place and grow. But they are evergreen, so there's a lot of daphnes. I don't think it's a good choice. Ceanothus is an evergreen that is native to this area. So Ceanothus volutinus. Ceanothus volutinus is the only one. The whole Ceanothus family is huge, and they're all beautiful flowering plants, but they're all really coastal, not hardy for this area. But that one it's low and spreading. So it's actually a good alternative to junipers. So we're going to move on real quick here to just a little bit more about plants, in particular perennial plants. So perennial plants are all the rage. We see a lot of that in landscaping these days. And they're great. There are a lot of good options. Most of them are drought tolerant. Most of them are deer resistant. Most of them flower or do something nice. The only issue is that they do require some care. So, some types of perennials are better planted in the first half of the year, not so much in the second half of the year. Just in the first half of the year, they'll often establish better. I'm thinking mostly echinacea is one. It's a drought tolerant perennial a lot of people really like, deer resistant and drought tolerant. And the new echinaceas are fabulous. But again, you can't plant them late in the season because they don't establish and then they die out over winter. So planting them, timing, but like any plant, you want to know what you're planting. Moving, you move them around in the spring or the fall. Dividing has to be done about every 3 to 5 years, in that range. 3 to 4, I like 4 years is a good time for dividing perennials. And that's just because they grow bigger, and then you don't want them that big anymore, so you cut them into pieces and put a little piece back in the middle. And then get rid of the rest, give them to your neighbor. Deadheading is sometimes required so that it doesn't seed all over the place. Combining them together so that you get better bloom times, because they don't all bloom all year long. They'll bloom in spring or summer or fall, so you need a mixture to get color if you want color. Controlling them is that part of that dividing thing, but it's also knowing when to yank something out. If it's becoming a problem, you might have to get rid of them. And with water management, as far as perennials go, they're pretty drought tolerant. In the picture, people are planting hostas, and people often overwater their hostas. They're quite drought tolerant, actually, and pretty tough. And they survive, but unfortunately, the deer like to eat them. So if it's not one thing, it's another, right? So I talked a little bit more just on this particular slide here about creepy ground covers, because this is a picture in spring. So this is April. And in April, things are beautiful. Things are flowering, they look great and beautiful. And you can blend all these are like rockery ground covers, Abretia, Erebus, Iberis, perennial alyssum, which is Arinia, and phlox, creeping phlox. These are all low flowering ground covers that bloom in the spring. And they're awesome. Like, I just love them. But not so much for commercial installations. strictly for, I would say, for homeowners, and where you have either gardeners or somebody who knows how to take care of them. They need to be cleaned up after they bloom. So ornamental grasses is the big one, because we do see a lot of these in the landscape. Many of them become really kind of old and die back for a bit, and they become a fire hazard as well, a lot of them. In particular, the pennisetum, what do they call that? Fountain grass is a really bad one, because it's not a good plant to begin with. It's commonly used in landscape, especially landscape architects, I think, use them a lot. It's because they always look at the pictures and it's in the summertime. It's like, wow, look how beautiful. Yeah, they're beautiful in the summer. But they don't leaf out, they don't put on any foliage until they're into June. So some grasses are good, some are not. That's one that's not a very good grass for most landscapes. But standard grasses, you can see all the different grasses in this picture. So the thing with grasses is that cool season grasses are up early and they're going to be growing really early. And that's like that one that looks like wheat, that's that Carl Forster grass. You see that everywhere. It's very popular. Perennial of the year, I think it was 2004, I think, 2005. Anyway, that's a picture of it there in the bottom right. Those are cool season grasses. The one above it is also blue oak grass. It's also cool season. So that just means you go out there in March and it's still snowing and those things are pushing up. They're like, let's go. I'm not waiting anymore. Gotta get going. So those grasses are good to go. Now in the lower picture are these big giant miscanthus grasses. And they are sort of a summer grass. So what you find with those is that they're really, really pretty and everything, but just don't expect to see them until middle of May. In the middle of May, they're starting to push up. And then by the time you get the end of May, they're getting pretty good. But it's not until the end of July when they're glory. So they're kind of a summer, fall type of plant. The problem with grasses, and those miscanthus are warm season. So you got cool season that shoot up early and warm season that shoot up late. And that pennisetum I talked about, it's late. So the planting of them has to be done in the springtime. That's the other thing with grasses, is they don't establish well when planted in the fall. You sometimes get away with it, depending on the weather, but they often need to be done in the spring. Same dividing. Cutting the grasses back is just a personal thing. Because of the fire issues, a lot of people like them to be cut right to the ground in the fall, which is great, and then they'll shoot up in the spring. But dividing is the key, is that when you do divisions of grasses, you do it in the springtime if you want to reuse them. Because springtime grasses, you can abuse them, work them out, move them here, move them there, cut them into pieces, every piece grows. In the fall, every piece dies. So if I want to have, depending what I want to do with the grasses, that's something that's important. But my biggest pet peeve is that especially with some of these commercial installations, and some designer puts in like 10,000 grasses into the design. Okay, well, what's the number one rule with grasses, right? Every 4 to 5 years, you got to dig them all out, cut them into pieces, and put a small piece back in the middle. They need dividing, just like other perennials do. What if personally, I haven't done that, so now I need an excavator. So that's why I get kind of emotional, or I get drives me nuts, because I've always said, you got to divide your grasses every 4 to 5 years. And it's like, yeah, okay, well that makes sense. And then 6, 7, 8, 10 years goes by, and you don't divide them, and then fine. Just try and dig out that grass now. It's not going to do. So that's the whole thing with ornamental grasses, is that it's a big maintenance thing. So like from a commercial standpoint, like if I had a planting and I had 100 grasses, I got to plan that $20,000 hit, dig them all out in the spring, because we have to do it when the time is right. Divide them all into pieces, take the healthiest pieces, put them back into the holes the way they were, remulch, refabric, whatever you're going to do. So there was a time, I would say back in the 90s, when I was doing a lot of landscape designing, and we used to use grasses all the time. It's like, that's a new thing. Everybody's using grasses. Now, years later, I'm going, don't use grasses. I use grasses in like somebody's yard, at somebody's house, but I wouldn't use them in landscapes, because it's just going to be an issue at some point. And there's one place down here on Springfield where they had like thousands of grasses around them, and they all started to die out, and I got hired to go in to consult on it, to say like, what are we doing with these? Why are all these grasses dying? And I said, well, how long have they been in the ground? They said, oh, 8 years. I said, oh, that's the problem. I said, they slowly just get worse and worse and uglier, and eventually they're not good anymore. You have to divide them around that year 4, year 5, when it's a human can do it, where you don't need a machine. And then, we keep them fresh and juvenile and looking great. That's the way to go. But unfortunately, again, commercial plantings, that particular site, I think we quoted them $35,000 to divide the grasses. And it's like, that was not guaranteed that was going to be enough. Like, how long would it take? I suggested switch them all out. It's cheaper just to dig the grasses out and replace them with little dwarf shrubs. Because then you don't have to worry about keeping them alive. You don't have to worry about, then you do it once and it's good for 20 years. You don't have to do anything. So I'm just going to zip through this fast because I know we're going to run out of time here. But some other types of plants, like hydrangeas, everybody loves hydrangeas because they're very colorful and they bloom all summer. And I don't really see problems with the hydrangeas that don't use a lot of water. And so there are some types that are water lovers. I guess it's the name hydrangea sounds like it's a watery plant, but panicle hydrangeas are very common. Now there's hundreds of different types. There's also dwarf forms. They bloom all summer and quite drought tolerant, actually, not bad. And of course, smooth hydrangeas, which is like an Annabelle hydrangea. They're actually quite good, and they're very drought tolerant. Mine, I don't know if I watered it at all this year, hardly, and it's fine. It stays much smaller, more well behaved. Some of the ones like the mountain hydrangea is just one of my favorites. It does need a little bit of water. It's closer. It's not the mop head type hydrangeas that like a lot of water, but this one needs a bit of water, but it's deer resistant. So I love deer resistant plants. It seems like there's deer everywhere. You go downtown Kelowna and it's like there's a deer crossing Bernard Street.
We have 12 resident ones here.
Yeah,
they
become
babies in the springs, twins.
That's right. They become residents of your area. And the funny thing that I noticed in Kelowna is they've learned to use the crosswalks. Has anybody else seen that? They'll sit there and you see them like they're standing on the side of the road and then the lights will change and they'll look up and they'll go across. And you're going like, I thought he was just standing there, but he was waiting for the light.
Just like they wait for the gate here. They know when people come in.
Yeah.
And they know when they're going to go out.
Animals are smart. Just goes to show you. So native plants again, native plants work with the local environment. They're good for wildlife. They're good for the pollinators. They're already soil adapted. So one of our issues in landscaping, especially here in the Okanagan, is we have to buy all of our soil and it all has to be blended and mixed. And I know some companies do it, some companies don't do it. We tend to do it because we want to have success, right? So it costs a lot more money to have blended soils compared to just using any old soil. But with fused native plants, they are fine. They don't want the blended soil. They just want the plain old soil that we have, which is just literally silt and sand here. That's our soil, what we call topsoil. So yeah, good for pollinators, already soil adapted, and they naturally don't need a lot of water. So that's a real benefit. So this brings us to right plant, right place. So this is one of the things that is really a critical part of landscape designing, is that unfortunately, remember I was talking earlier about how grass and plants, we train them to need water all the time? Because of the way we just grow them like that for years by watering all the time, that the grass becomes dependent on it. If it ever dries out, it's in danger, it almost dies. But with right plant, right place, the part that's sort of similar is that I go to some places and some stratas and all the shrubbery is trimmed into a ball shape. Right? They're all ball shapes. And people are like, oh, I just love this. This is such a cool effect. And those are topiaries, right? And so the thing that happens is when you see a plant that's turned into a ball shape, what I'm thinking is that plant's in the wrong spot. It's obviously too big for its location. Like if you have one of these dwarf plants we were talking about, you'd never trim it. Maybe once every 5 years, maybe 8 years. Like when would you trim it? So, and I think of some of the larger stratas, and they have these guys going around with hedge trimmers just trimming, and they go all the way through the whole strata, and they go with just for weeks on end, and then they finally get to the end, and they come back to the beginning and start over again. And I just go like, what the heck's going on here? So what it boils down to is the right plant, right place means you don't trim anything. You do basic health management, so you keep the plants healthy. And the occasional plant is just too happy in its location, so it grows faster than what you thought. So you move it. You just move it. You don't trim it yet. There's no trimming. This slight bit of pruning every second year or so. Just this occasional twig. Dead wood removal. So the thing with plants that are heavily trimmed all the time, they tend to be a fire hazard. And it's because when you trim a plant, the outer portion of it forms this dense mat of these tiny little twigs, and the whole inside of the bush becomes quite dead, and all that material, it's not even a little bit alive, it's all crunchy, crispy dead. So if an ember or anything went into a trimmed shrub like that, yeah, that'd be a fire for sure. So trimming plants, and that's what the problem with hedges, I guess, is one of them, is that they're trimmed so much. So the theory is if you let a plant grow in its natural form, where it just, if it's supposed to look like this or whatever the shape, the form is part of landscape design. But the plant has its own natural shape that actually, somewhere down the line, may have happened that way to reduce the wildfire issue, wherever they live, wherever they're from. So their natural habit just naturally is not a fire promoting situation. But hit it with a hedge trimmer a couple times and it becomes a fire hazard. So the plants are way healthier if they're in the right place, because you don't have to do anything really to them, just let them grow. And and this has all changed due to climate change, and it's just ultimately that the plants now have to be reselected. And this is where we're headed, I guess, in the future. We'll be changing plants out. So right plant, right place uses the plant's natural shape. It prevents unnatural conditions that promote disease. Has a more natural appearance. Maintenance staff need more training, though, to do a lot less work, and use smarts instead of money. And that's one of the things, like I say, I just can envision some of these places where nobody hedge trims anything. It's like a utopia. So hedge trimming, this is the issue, right? Is it creates a fire hazard. It's very, very expensive. And it's bad for the plants. Plants don't like being sheared so much. I mean, a hedge is one thing. Like if it's a hedge, yeah, I'll trim a hedge. There's no problem with that. A topiary, like that's what this is, a picture of a bunch of topiaries. So it's like in a park or something. Absolutely, have some beautiful topiaries. But it's an indicator of bad design. Usually what happens is that the plant is planted too close to the walkway, and if you let it grow, you wouldn't be able to get in your house. So you gotta trim it, right? Or you could move it. And moving it, I recommend, rather than trimming it. So it's also bad for the environment because these things, the amount of smoke and gas these things produce, and noise pollution and all that stuff. I'm really enjoying all the electrical maintenance equipment that's coming out. It's so much better. Now they have better batteries, better units. It's fabulous, way quieter, no pollution, and they don't break down, which is also nice, which means when somebody goes to work, they're gonna be able to continue to work, not stop, try to get stupid things started for half an hour. So again, some of these things are sort of natural shapes too, and some of them are not. I think that when you have something like a pom-pom juniper or something like that, that's not a fire hazard at all. And it's nice to have a couple of features, we call them specimens. There's nothing wrong with that. And, the topiary stuff, again, is more for like a park or something. And sometimes it's nice to trim things. But I just see, like, it's from a commercial standpoint, it's probably going to go the way of the dinosaurs at some point. So these are a bunch of boxwoods, proper pruning of a hedge, which is really important. And I don't see a lot of people doing it, but we learned to do hedges like this back in '85. And it's a fabulous way to trim a hedge. Nice and triangulated like that, narrow at the top, wide at the bottom. Grows right to the ground, nice and thick. So when things are not done right, it means more work. So tree care, we're talking about when you prune a tree, now we're talking ornamental trees, not fruit trees. Never confuse the two. What somebody does to a fruit tree shocks anybody who knows how to prune ornamental trees. You don't do any of that stuff. with a ornamental tree. So we're just talking ornamentals. So you prune trees to make them better, not smaller. And that's a shock, I think, for a lot of people. Oh, it's getting too big. Why are you pruning it? Well, it's just getting too big. It's like, well, the more you cut it, the faster it grows. If you cut off 20 feet, it'll grow back in like a year. But it might cost you $1,500 to prune it, and then its shape will be ruined. So plants have a natural way of growing, and it's strong and stable. And the more you disrupt that natural shape, the weaker they get. And the more they break apart and become dangerous ultimately. And the more you prune them, the faster they grow. So you don't prune any plants to keep them smaller other than temporary. That's why with these shrubs, putting the wrong plant in the wrong space means that you're going to be on it forever. There's no end to it, right? You got to be on it forever because you've got to keep them small. Or you could just buy a plant that stays that big. That's my suggestion. So remove the dead, diseased, and dying wood is pretty much all you do for ornamental trees. That's the amount of pruning you do. So you just go in and cut out dead stuff. You look at the tree from a distance, you might see, well, I have one branch is sticking out. I'll cut that one out. So you take the whole branch right off, right back to the stem. Gone. That's it. I'm done. What they're doing now with the Fire Smart is trimming them up at least about 7 feet off the ground, so that one of the issues with fire is that it doesn't spread that much from down below, but if it gets up into a tree, it will spread like crazy for long distances. So they don't want them getting into trees. I was involved last winter with a large clearing, about 30 acres, where we had to go in and make it fire smart, right? So all the pine trees and Douglas firs trimmed up to 20 feet. And then all the ground was scattered with needles and twigs and branches everywhere. And we talked to the guys, they're forestry guys, right, that do this, because this was a wild area. And they said, oh yeah, don't worry about the stuff on the ground. If that catches on fire, it doesn't burn the ground fire. He says, what you don't want is you don't want it to go up the tree. Because then that's going to be a problem. That's when the whole forest grows. So interesting. So just for the plant's health with trees, we maintain a tree well around the base of the tree. Depending on the size of the tree, we just don't want any grass growing too close to the tree. Ideally, a minimum of like 3 feet from the trunk, so a 3-foot radius. And it's really tough in small areas where you have a tree planted in a spot that the lawn is very tiny. It doesn't make sense. The tree really shouldn't be there, but it's one of those things. So, so you maintain a tree well around the base of the tree with a little bit of composty mulch in there, so it represents sort of similar to what the tree might find in nature, but we don't want any mulch against the trunk of the tree. So we need a 12-inch, so you can envision it, if you have a 3-foot radius, the first 12 inches out from the trunk has nothing in there, just air. And that's because with trees, when they get that little bit of that mulch in there, like especially a composting mulch, like Nature's Gold or something, they love it. They're just like, oh my God, what's this? They grow their roots up into it. And so you don't want them growing up roots right around the base of the tree at the trunk, because those roots will actually strangle the tree out, strangle the base of the tree after about 10 years. So you don't want to promote that. So the new trees should always have a donut shape. You know, I've been promoting that for years, but I still don't see anybody doing it. It just looks so much nicer to have the mulch right up to the trunk. Primarily pruned during the dormant season, which is most common. But when you're pruning out dead wood of trees, you can do it any time. Because often it's easier to see the dead wood in the summertime because it doesn't have leaves. And like I was saying, trimming up at least 7 feet off the ground to prevent the fire from spreading. So general rules for pruning. You know, I just really recommend that anybody at some point should take a pruning class to learn some of the basics of pruning. And if you're in the gardening world, you better have taken a pruning class, at least 1 or 2 or 3. So, maintain constant taper on a tree. That's key. And as you can't have that constant taper, so the trunk starts big at the bottom and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes up. And maintain 1 central leader whenever possible. Some species you can't do it, but with most trees, maples, that sort of thing, 1 central leader all the way up is the strongest structure. And no flush cuts. Don't cut too close to the trunk. That can cause major disease issues in the end of the tree. So you can leave stubs. In the old days, we used to say, don't leave you got any stubs? Whatever you do, because that was what the actual science said. But now, after I think they did it and looked at the results, and it causes massive death of the trunk itself by cutting too close to the tree. So that's part of learning pruning, is to know not to do that, so no flesh cuts. Try not to remove branches that are bigger than 6 inches in diameter. So that's where if trees are being managed over time, you shouldn't have to remove a branch that's 6 inches in diameter. It causes major issues with the tree. The tree can often survive it, but it stresses them out tremendously. And that's when trees and plants get under stress, they tend to develop diseases and insect problems. So we don't want diseases or insect problems. We want happy trees so that they're just do what they're supposed to do, provide some shade. So don't remove all the small twigs from inside. That's a rookie mistake. Rookie mistake is when people go inside and they trim off all the little twigs inside the tree. Because there's these little twigs, they have leaves on them, leave them. Because every leaf on that tree is part of the factory that's making the food supply for the cells that are just inside the trunk there. So the trunk right there, it's using that little tuft of leaves to feed that little area. So you leave all those, you don't cut them out. And learning to identify strong branch attachments is really important. And something we do when we plant a new tree is that we before we plant it, we just quickly look at the tree and we look for bad branch attachments. So where these little branches are not attaching properly, and then we cut those ones out, plant the tree. And then at that point, it goes into the future with at least a basic idea. All right, so take a pruning class and learn the best practices of pruning. Read about it after taking the class, which is really good, and practice with somebody who knows. And I wouldn't practice with this guy, because I learned a long time ago, do not put your head between the... I learned that the hard way. So I always liked that picture. Pruning shrubs is a little different, just because with shrubs you have all these multiple stems. And again, if you get the right plant in the right place, you don't really do anything with it. You do what's called a seasonal rejuvenation. So each year you remove a couple of the oldest branches, and that's it. Done. So in the spring cleanup, you would cut out 2 to 3 branches off of each shrub, and that's it. There you go. That brings to mind, if you do know your plant identification, you would know what that plant was. So you would know if it blooms in the summer or in the spring or in the fall, so you know how to prune it properly. If you do know how to prune it, then you know what the blooming wood is. So if you know what it's going to bloom on, you don't want to cut it right before it flowers, and you don't want to, cause problems down the road. But the way that I teach pruning, there's no issue with that. And I'll maybe talk about that if we have more time. The form is just a natural shape of a plant. So some plants are very low and flat on the top. Some plants are naturally rounded. Some plants have sort of a vase shape. Some are very tall and skinny. Some are like a big teardrop shape. And some of them are like a big fountain shape or big, arching stems. Well, that's their natural shape. That's why I picked those. I picked those plants in that landscape design for those effects, because they look so cool, right? That's the way they look. And I put that plant there because it looks like that. And that fine foliage beside the big coarse leaves looks really great. That's a great combination. So, in the landscape designing, if you know the right plants, then you can get them in the right places, hopefully. And then, I guess it's experience is part of it too. But you're relying a lot on the form, not necessarily the seasonality of it, but seasonality might be important depending on how much color you want. I want it to bloom all year round. I want it to bloom in the spring, and I want it to bloom in May, and then June, and July, and August, and it's like, okay, you can do that. Get a bit of a mishmash, but that's all right. It can be colorful. Space allowance now is one of the key things, so that the plants are just really widely spaced, probably 8 feet apart, something like that, 10 feet apart. This is where the trimming comes in. So if it's a dwarf conifer, it doesn't need any trimming. The twiggy shrubs, they're these little tiny shrubs like a spirea that gets these tiny little twigs. You trim those off with a hedge trimmer. It's just the fastest way to go. Those plants tend to be so dense, they tend to grow in like a little mounding shape. that's how they grow anyway, so they can be trimmed with a hedge trimmer. The cane shrubs, on the other hand, are bigger, larger, upright shrubs that have big canes and branches. And when you prune a cane shrub, you do selective removal of branches to achieve the shape you want. And the shape you should want is the shape it wants to be. So, like I say, we go inside, take the biggest stem and just saw it out and remove it. And then we go in and take the second biggest stem, saw it out right at the ground, saw it out, remove it. Now stand back and look at it and see the way it looks. And then if it's got something hanging off to the side, cut it to the bottom and remove it. And then you're probably done. Simple as that. So really fast, really easy, really works. And way less work. So I don't know how we're doing for time here. Does anybody know? I see the clock over there. Oh, yeah, we're running out of time. So, just some of these things on mulches. I talked about that already. And, organic mulch looks really good. Like this is you can't really see it really clear, but this is a real fine sort of nature's gold mulch. And plants are very colorful. Again, their landscape and landscape designs always reflect the individual who lives there. Because why wouldn't it, right? People work, the client should be having their input on what they want. And it can be quite pretty. And keep compost-based mulches where possible and keep them fresh. So as far as the plants are concerned, they want the compost. There's no question. Don't give me rock, I want compost. Rock is hot. The sun shines on rock and reflects it on me. I get cooked in the sun because of the rock. It's like, too bad. You're putting rock around me anyway. So darker colored mulches absorb the heat, so they help to keep the heat off the plants actually. And it holds moisture in the ground so beautifully. And remember that all the microbes in the earth is full of microbes, little living organisms that rely on compost to stay alive. The roots of the plants need those microbes to be healthy. So whenever possible, use a compost-based mulch, but it's not always possible. So we do the best we can. So in a quick summary, so we're going to reduce water use, we're going to reduce the amount of trimming, adjust plants by removal and possibly no replacement. It's one of the things that we do find sometimes. Somebody removes a plant and they're like, well, now what are you going to put in that spot? I go like, nothing. A rock. Perfect, an ornamental rock. There you go. So replace with herbaceous perennials or deciduous shrubs. Remove conifers that are too close to buildings. Hire good maintenance people who know what they're doing. And redesign as needed, right plant, right place in mind. And reduce water features a bit. And maybe turn them into dry riverbeds. Something that we've had some experience with. The next step is to hire trustworthy consultants, so people who know what they're doing, and learn more about irrigation. So a few years ago I did a tour where I went to all the garden centers in the valley and put on free seminars on called Understanding Your Irrigation System. And it's super useful. But that was my contribution to conserving water in the valley, just because I thought most people don't know how to use an irrigation system and they don't even know how it works. So, if they understood the basics, they would approach it completely different. So educate the community on leaving plants alone, and that's the difficult part. Because, like I was saying, is that people get addicted to that look. Pom-poms, cubes, diamonds, different shaped shrubs, all indicating that there's something wrong with the plant placement. At least to me, I go, oh, they put it in the wrong place. So they turn it into a ball now. So if they can be, I don't think any of the plants that I see out right now can just be left alone. It would have to be readjusted in the landscape. But that's okay. That's just knowing it is good. And keep plants tidy, debris cleaned up. Broadleaf evergreens are good options to replace hedges, and that's a challenge. Like I was saying, maybe the Prunus lorocerassus, the laurel. If we get a Russian laurel that'll live in this climate, that might be a good option. Or pyracantha, but it's so thorny. Oh my God. Okay, so if a fire is coming, get out of the way. There may be no possible way for humans to stop it. And this is what's happening right now down in LA, is people are going like, you should have done this, or you should have done that. And they're all trying to point fingers at each other. And it's like, no. When that fire comes and the wind is blowing, you just run as fast as you can. All your fire-resistant plants will burn. Everything will burn. Everything will burn. it's like you got to get out of there. So just the key thing is to note that, yeah, run away. It's best. Conserve water today for tomorrow's needs. Follow fire smart guidelines and develop a strategy for your community for emergencies. So we talked about flooding, we talked about fire, we talked about, other issues that could pop up. Why not have a community focus on safety and emergency situations? So change is happening now. Change is good. Change is necessary. Change will help a lot. Change is good. Donkey. Remember that one? That would be, what's his name? The green guy. Shrek.
And Donkey the dog.
Donkey's the donkey. Yeah. All right, so that's it for today. Really appreciate you having me out again today. We're going to do some question answers. If you guys have any questions, I might have worn you out there with different information. But remember to check our websites, growercoach.com, khslandscape.com. Also, check out all our videos. I have a lot of videos going on YouTube. Some are really old, and some are really new. Some are okay. It's getting better. Anyway, lots of fun doing that. So, so that's it. So, thanks very much. And does anybody have a question?